Late October, the year 1873. Out near the Colorado-New Mexico line, where the scrub brush grew in wiry patches across the dust-packed hills and the wind carried stories from no one to nowhere. The land had gone quiet since the last storm passed through, taking the leaves with it, bending fence posts like old men's backs. Mornings came cold, biting through wool and leather, and it was on such a morning that Elijah Turner rode alone with only his gelding Clay and the ache in his shoulder that never seemed to leave since the war. He had not spoken a word to another soul in 6 days. The last had been a ranch hand in Taos who offered him coffee and a crooked smile. Elijah had nodded, taken the cup, and ridden off before nightfall. He didn't much care for lingering. The quiet suited him. Or maybe he just didn't know what else to do with the noise when it came. His coat was lined with dust, collar turned up, hat pulled low. The reins lay slack in his hand, the horse walking steady beneath him. Every hoofbeat jarred the bruise in his ribs. He'd taken a fall the week before when Clay spooked at a snake in a dry wash. He hadn't cursed or cried out, just lay there staring at the emptiness above him until he could breathe again. Nothing but the hard sky and the wind that didn't care if he lived or died. It was near noon when he saw her. At first she looked like a lump of rags off the side of the road. He would ridden past if Clay hadn't stopped and turned his ears forward. Elijah narrowed his eyes. The shape didn't move. He clicked his tongue, rode closer. It was a woman. She was curled on her side, face turned from the sun, arms folded around her stomach. Dirt was caked up her skirt and in her hair. Her shoes were worn down to nothing. Beside her sat a canvas sack half spilled with what looked like a jar of cornmeal and a child's coat. Elijah dismounted, slow, knees stiff. He crouched beside her, hesitated, then reached to touch her shoulder. She flinched and turned, her eyes wild, then cracked and dry. She tried to sit up, failed. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "You need water." She didn't answer, but her hand lifted weakly, palm open. He went to his saddlebag, brought the canteen. She drank with trembling fingers, spilling half down her front. When she finished, her lips were still cracked, but her eyes had softened enough to meet his. "There more of you?" he asked. Her mouth worked like it wanted to speak, but no words came. She shook her head. "You walkin'?" he asked, though he already knew. "From where?" She closed her eyes like the question hurt. Then very quiet, "Las Almas." He looked back the way he'd come. That was more than 40 miles. "You alone?" he said again, slower. She looked at the sack. "My children. We walked till I couldn't no more. They're hid. Up by the rocks." He turned toward the ridgeline, saw nothing but scrub and shale. "How many?" "5, she whispered. "Please. They're hungry." He stood, scanned the slope. If coyotes hadn't found them first, it'd be a mercy. But he didn't say that. "You wait here," he said. "Rest. I'll go." The children were huddled under an outcropping, half asleep and half frozen, their small bodies pressed together. He had to coax them out with gentle words and pieces of biscuit from his saddlebag. One by one they followed him back, barefoot, silent like ghosts. When their mother saw them, she sobbed without sound, pulling them into her arms. Elijah didn't ask questions. Not yet. He gave them what food he had built, a fire low behind the rocks. Let them eat with shaking hands and soot-smudged cheek. The littlest one fell asleep with a crust of bread still in her hand. The woman sat apart, watching him. "Name's Elijah," he said, finally settling onto a rock, firelight flickering in his tired eyes. She hesitated. Then, "Quiet, Clara." He nodded as if that explained something. It didn't. But it was enough for now. The sky deepened into indigo wind, whistling low across the basin. The world hadn't softened. It never did. But around the fire there was breath and warmth. Clara held her youngest close and stared into the flames like they might burn the past clean. Elijah stared at her, and something inside him, long buried, shifted. The wind picked up just before dawn, tugging at the edges of the old tarp Elijah had pulled from his saddle roll to cover the children. He'd given them the warmest space, near the fire, circling rocks tight around the flames so the heat wouldn't slip away too fast. Still, they shivered in their sleep. Clara never closed her eyes, just sat there watching them, arms wrapped around her knees, face pale in the half-light. Elijah stoked the fire with a dry stick, the movement slow and steady like everything he did. His hands were cracked, the skin across his knuckles split and raw, but he didn't seem to notice. When he glanced over at Clara, she looked away. "You ain't eaten," he said. She shook her head. "Better they have it." He didn't argue, just tore the last biscuit in two and handed her half. She hesitated, then took it, holding it between both hands like it might disappear. They sat in silence, chewing. The fire snapped once, and one of the boys stirred, mumbling something in his sleep. Elijah figured the oldest was around 10, the youngest barely walking. All of them hollow-eyed and thin-skinned, stretched too tight over their bones. "You walk all the way from Las Animas?" he said finally. Clara didn't answer at first, then started there. "My husband left us in July. Said he was headed to Raton to look for work. Never came back. I waited 2 months. Nothing. No word. No money. Just dust and heat." Her voice was low, even like she was telling it to herself more than to him. "Neighbors helped when they could," she went on. "But folks ain't got much themselves. So we walked. I thought maybe if we could get to the railroad someone might know something, or we'd find work. Somewhere." Elijah listened, eyes on the fire. He didn't ask why she hadn't left sooner. He knew what it felt like to wait for something that wasn't coming back. "My boy got sick," she added, nodding toward the middle child. "Fever broke 3 days ago. But I could feel him slipping. I carried him half the way yesterday. Then my legs just gave out." She looked at him then. "I didn't think anyone stopped." "I nearly didn't," Elijah said, voice flat. "Thought you were a bundle of rags." Clara gave a dry, quiet laugh. "Ain't far off." The children woke slowly, one at a time. Elijah shared what little he had left, a half pouch of oats and a sliver of jerky. The kids ate it like it was feast day. Clara still held herself apart, like she didn't know whether to be grateful or ashamed. Elijah didn't push her. He saddled Clay, tied the sack tighter to the back, then turned to her. "There's a line shack I passed 3, maybe 4 miles east. Had a roof and a stove, far as I saw. We get there, I can ride into town, fetch food, maybe a wagon." Clara looked up at him, wary. "Town's far. Too far for you to walk it again. Especially with them kids." She nodded, slow. "All right." It took most of the morning to get them there. The older kids walked, Elijah carrying the smallest girl in the crook of one arm while leading Clay with the other. Clara limped behind, jaw clenched tight against the pain in her legs. She never complained. The shack was near a dried-up creek bed tucked behind a stand of scrub oak. Roof was solid, though the door hung crooked on one hinge. Inside, dust blanketed everything, but the stove was good iron, and there was a pile of wood stacked in the corner. Someone had used it not too long ago. Elijah lit a fire and got the children settled while Clara swept the floor with a frayed broom left behind. She moved like she had to stay upright or she'd never get back up again. Elijah watched her for a moment before going outside to unsaddle Clay. When he came back in, she was standing in the doorway, hair hanging loose around her face, eyes soft and full of something he couldn't quite name. "You could have left me there," she said. "I've done that before," he answered, looking past her. "But you didn't." "No." She didn't ask why. He didn't know the answer anyway. That night, after the children had fallen asleep under patched blankets, Clara sat by the stove, rubbing her feet with a wet cloth. Her skin was raw, some of it split open. Elijah handed her a tin of salve from his bag. She took it wordlessly. "You fight?" she asked after a while. He nodded. "Union Cavalry. Missouri Regiment." She didn't say anything for a while. "Then my brother died near Shiloh." Elijah didn't respond, just stared at the flame through the stove's open grate. So much had been lost in that war, men, land, time, meaning. It left everyone a little quieter than they used to be. Outside, the wind moaned through the scrub. Inside, there was firelight, the sound of children breathing, and something else hanging in the air between them, fragile, unnamed, but no longer empty. The land still speaks to those who wait. Subscribe and listen. The next morning brought frost thin and silver across the packed dirt outside the shack. Elijah rose early, used a stick to scrape ice from the water bucket. His breath came out in pale clouds, and every movement made the old ache in his shoulder throb like a warning. He ignored it. Inside, Clara stirred near the stove blanket draped over her shoulders. She was already checking the children, brushing straw from their hair, pressing a hand to each forehead. Her hands moved slow but sure, like she'd done this 1,000 times, even if her body looked like it was running on sheer grit. Elijah poured water into a dented pot and set it on the stove. "I'll ride to town," he said without turning. "Bring back what I can. Food, medicine, maybe clothes." Clara stood up straighter, eyes sharpening. "You sure?" "I said I would." She nodded, but he saw the tension in her jaw. She didn't like relying on anyone. He understood that. She pulled her blanket tighter and looked down at her bare feet. "Town's 3 hours if the trail holds," he said. "I'll be back by dusk. What if something happens?" He looked at her then. "If I don't come back, you'll know I didn't mean to stay gone." That seemed to satisfy her, though she didn't speak again. He saddled Clay, wrapped himself in his coat, and took the trail east without another word. Clara stood at the doorway, arms crossed, watching until he disappeared into the dry hills. The ride was quiet. The wind followed him, catching the edges of his coat, carrying dust into his teeth. Sagebrush rustled low across the land, and the sun climbed slow through a pale sky. By the time he reached town, a crooked sprawl of adobe buildings and timber fronts, his throat was dry and the stiffness in his leg had grown worse. He stopped at the Mercantile, first traded the last of his silver pocket watch for flour beans, salt pork, and lye soap. The shopkeep raised an eyebrow when Elijah asked for 5 pairs of small shoes and a sack of peppermint drop. "Yours?" the man asked, tilting his chin. "No," Elijah said, "but I reckon they matter." He rode next to the doctor's place, a low building with a green-shuttered window and a cracked stoop. Doc Tanner, a man Elijah had known in passing since the war, came out, wiping his hands on a towel. "You look like you've been trampled," the doctor said. "Not me. Woman and 5 kids. Found 'em off the old Las Animas road. One's still fevered." Tanner frowned. "You bring 'em in? They can't make the ride." The doctor nodded. "I'll pack a case. Might come myself tomorrow." Elijah left town with 2 sacks heavy across Clay's back and an ache in his chest he hadn't had in years. He wasn't used to thinking about someone waiting for him. He didn't know what to do with that feeling. By the time the shack came back into view, dusk had begun to sink its teeth into the sky. Smoke curled thin from the chimney. The children burst out when they saw him, cheering like it was Christmas, their bare feet slapping the cold ground. Elijah dismounted and started pulling down the bundles. Clara came last, walking with a limp hair tied back with a strip of cloth. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. "You came back," she said. He handed her a jar of molasses and a wrapped bundle of flannel. "Told you I would." That night they feasted like beggars who'd stumbled into a forgotten kitchen. Beans boiled with pork, warm bread off a fire-heated stone, the children sticky with molasses and grinning through broken baby teeth. Clara ate, slow eyes moving from one child to the next like she couldn't quite believe they were still here, still breathing. Later, after they'd all fallen asleep in a pile of blankets and elbows, she sat beside Elijah at the stove. "My husband," she said quietly, "wasn't always cruel. He used to sing to the babies, build them little toys from corn husks. Then the drought came, and something in him just dried up." Elijah said nothing. "I don't know if he's dead or if he just stopped loving us," she whispered. "And I don't know which would be worse." The stove popped, sending sparks against the iron. Elijah looked at her, then down at his hands. "Sometimes," he said, "men come back from something broken. Sometimes they don't come back at all." She didn't ask what he meant. He didn't explain. Outside, the wind had gone quiet, as if the land was listening. Inside, two people sat in silence. Not comfortable, not easy, but real. And real was more than either of them had known in a long time. The days settled into a rhythm, rough, quiet, and honest. Elijah patched a hole in the shack roof with scrap tin he'd hauled from town. Clara spent her mornings boiling water, washing small clothes, and keeping the children fed. They worked side by side without much talk, and when they did speak, it was soft and short, like neither one wanted to risk the silence too much. By the fourth day, the fever had left the boy. His color came back in his cheeks, and he asked for more bread. Clara wept in the yard where no one could see her. Elijah found her by the split woodpile after supper, leaning against the beam like her legs didn't want to hold her anymore. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, wiping at her cheeks. "I'm just tired is all." He knew it was more than that, but he didn't press. She looked at him then. "You always live this way out here alone?" "I do now." "You got people somewhere?" "No one waiting on me," he said. "Buried my brother after the war. Parents passed before I left Missouri." She picked at the splintered edge of the wood beam. "You never married?" He shook his head. "Wasn't in me. Not then." Clara gave a dry smile. "And now?" He didn't answer. The truth was, he'd felt something strange building in him since the day he found her, like a splinter working its way out, slow and painful but clean. He didn't know what it was, not exactly, but it hurt in a different kind of way. That night, after the fire had gone low and the children slept, Elijah sat outside the shack watching the stars come up. They blinked cold and small above the ridgeline, no comfort to anyone. Clara joined him after a while, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "I thought I'd die out there," she said. "My legs wouldn't move. I kept seeing them, my babies, just walking off into the dark without me." Her voice cracked. "I would died," she said, "if you hadn't stopped." Elijah didn't look at her. "I think maybe I needed to." They sat there, both staring at the ground like the answers might be buried there. After a while, Clara spoke again. "Do you ever wonder if life gives you a second chance or just a different ending?" He looked over at her. The firelight caught the curve of her cheekbone, the hollow beneath her eyes. "I wonder," he said. "Don't know which it is." A breeze stirred the brush, soft as breath. Somewhere far off, a coyote called out. She didn't touch him. He didn't move closer. But something shifted between them. A weight passed from one hand to the other, silent and heavy, shared without words. By the next morning, Elijah had set a plan in motion. He'd spotted an old cattle barn half a mile down the creek bed, still had bones, needed work. He offered to rebuild it, make it livable through winter. Clara didn't say yes, but she didn't say no. She just brought him water while he worked and kept the children close enough to help without slowing him down. She'd changed in small ways. Her eyes weren't so wide with fear. Her shoulders didn't flinch when he raised his voice to call out for more nails or pass the hammer. She was still thin, but there was a steadiness to her now. She began to look like someone with ground under her feet again. He caught the oldest boy, James, carving a stick into the shape of a horse one afternoon. Elijah sat beside him, showed him how to smooth the edges so it wouldn't splinter. The boy didn't talk much, but when he handed the finished toy to his little sister, and she squealed with delight, Elijah saw him smile. That evening, Clara stood in the doorway of the shack, arms crossed, watching Elijah stack the last beam against the new frame. "You building this for us?" she asked. He looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Building it for whoever needs it." "But you thought we'd stay." "I hoped you might." Clara looked at the barn, then at the horizon. "It's a hard thing choosing to stay when you've been made to run so long." He didn't reply. He didn't need to. She was telling him more than she ever had. Inside, the children laughed. Someone had found a cricket, and it had set off a storm of giggles. Clara looked toward the sound and smiled, but it faded fast. "They'll ask soon," she said, "about their father." Elijah stood straight. "And what will you tell them?" "I don't know." "That he left. That we kept going. That someone stopped when they didn't have to." She paused. "That maybe that was enough." Elijah's voice came quiet. "It is." She met his eyes then, and something raw passed between them. Not romance, not yet, but trust. Real and earned. The sky above them faded into dusk again, but it didn't feel so cold this time. It wasn't long before word got around that Elijah Turner was building out by the dry creek bed. Folks from town passed through now and then, ranchers, a traveling preacher, a few children from nearby homesteads. Most came out of curiosity. Some brought supplies. A sack of potatoes. An old skillet. A pair of boots 2 sizes too big but still useful. Clara kept to herself when they came, her smile polite but measured. She stayed close to the shack or with the children. Elijah could feel her watching, tense and alert, as if the wrong word might send her packing again. And maybe it could. The questions always came light and easy on the surface, but sharp underneath. "She yours, Eli? You got yourself a family now?" He never answered, not with more than a look. Most folks didn't press. The West taught you fast to mind your own business, but not everyone. It was a gray afternoon when Paul Rankin rode up the creek trail, his hat tipped back and his mouth already moving. Rankin had known Elijah back in Taos, owned a saloon, and a small herd, liked to talk more than work. He was younger than Elijah, but carried the swagger of someone used to being listened to. "Well, I'll be damned," Rankin said, swinging off his horse. "Heard you were playing husband out here." Elijah didn't move from where he was fitting the doorframe. "You heard wrong." Rankin's eyes scanned the yard, landing on Clara, where she stood rinsing clothes in a basin. "She's a fine one, though. Looks tough. Like she'd bite if you got too close." Clara didn't flinch, but her eyes narrowed just a hair. Elijah stepped down from the doorway. "You got something to say, say it." Rankin laughed. "Don't get touchy. Just wondering what the plan is. You gonna keep feeding someone else's brats you barely fed yourself last year?" "Plans changed." "Yeah, I bet they did." He walked closer, squinting toward the barn. "You fixing this place up for her or for you?" Elijah's voice came low. "Leave. You serious? You came out here to stir dust. I don't owe you a thing." For a beat, Rankin stood still, hands on his hips. Then he spat and the dirt, turned and mounted his horse. "Hell of a waste," he muttered. "You're always saving someone, never yourself." He rode off without looking back. That night Elijah chopped wood until the sun dipped behind the ridge. He didn't say a word, not even when Clara brought him water. She waited a while, watching him with guarded eyes. "You knew him?" He nodded. "A long time ago." "You were friends?" "Not really." She studied him for a moment. "He's wrong, you know." Elijah paused, hand on the axe handle. "About what?" "About you always saving others." He didn't respond. Just split another log. Clara moved closer, voice quiet. "You didn't just give us food and shelter. You gave them hope. You gave me something I didn't think I'd feel again." He looked up, sweat dripping from his brow. "What's that?" She swallowed. "Safe." The word hung in the air between them, fragile and heavy. Elijah nodded once, like that settled something. Then he went back to work, slower now, more deliberate. But the next day, Clara didn't come to the barn. And the day after that, she was gone before sunup, walking the ridge trail alone. Elijah watched her from the creek bed, heart tight. He didn't follow. By the third day, she spoke little, keeping busy with the children and leaving meals by the stove without waiting to see if he'd eat. Elijah knew what it was, fear creeping back and quiet and cold. Not of him, but of the future. Of trusting too much. Of depending on someone who could still walk away. That night he knocked on the doorframe of the shack. She looked up from where she sat darning socks. "You need something?" she asked. "I need to know if you're thinking of leaving." She set the sock down, her face unreadable. "I think of it every day." "Why haven't you?" She looked past him to the barn he'd built, to the ridge that led out into the unknown. "Because I don't want to run anymore," she said. "But I don't know if I can stay without losing myself." Elijah stepped inside, slow. "You ain't lost. Not even close." She met his eyes, and there was pain there, but also something steady beneath it. "You're not him," she whispered. "But I keep waiting for you to turn into him. To get tired. To leave." He shook his head. "I'm not leaving." "You say that now? I'll keep saying it." She stood then, closer than she'd ever been, looking up at him. "You don't have to fix everything," she said. "I know. You don't have to be the strong one all the time." He hesitated, then said, "I don't know how to be anything else." She reached out her fingers, brushing his wrist. "Not holding, just touching. Then let me learn with you." The fire crackled behind them. Outside, the land stretched dark and wide, but for the first time it didn't feel empty. It felt like something was beginning. The first snowfall came early that year, light and dry, a whisper of white across the grass on the slope of the barn roof. The children ran out barefoot before Clara could stop them, laughing as their footprints melted into the cold dirt. She let them be. Some things, even frostbitten toes, were worth the joy. Elijah spent the day hauling firewood and tightening the window covers. He moved with purpose, not just from need, but because motion kept the doubts at bay. There was no plan beyond tomorrow, no promise, but the work. That was enough. Had to be. Inside the barn, he'd cleared a corner for tools, stacked supplies, made shelves from scrap lumber. He was building something without a name, and Clara knew it. She could feel the care in each nail, each measured cut. Not for himself, he had never lived like that. But for what might come after, they both chose it. And yet, as winter crept closer, something unsettled moved beneath the surface. A letter came, smudged and creased, delivered by a ranch hand who passed by on his way to Santa Fe. It bore no return mark, just a name scrawled across the fold in blocky, hard strokes: Thomas Hale. Clara stood with it in her hand for hours before opening it. She didn't cry when she read it. She didn't speak. She folded it once, tucked it into the hem of her shawl, and went back to stirring the stew. Elijah didn't ask. Not at first. But that night, long after the children were asleep, he stepped into the shack and saw her sitting alone, the letter laid out beside her like a ghost. "You want to tell me what it says?" he asked. She didn't look up. "He's alive." Silence. "He's in Fort Garland, working the rail. Said he's sorry. Said he was lost. That he wants to see the children. Maybe try again." Elijah's jaw clenched. Not with anger. Not yet. But with something old and familiar, the ache of something slipping out of your hands before you'd even had the chance to hold it. "He left you to die." "I know. And now—" Clara pressed her fingers to her temples. "I don't know. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, Elijah. He's their father." He knelt in front of her, slow, like the air had thickened between them. You're not beholden to a man who abandoned his blood." She looked at him then, eyes rimmed red. "But I'm scared. If I stay with you, what happens when things get hard, when there's nothing left to build or fix? I don't have anything left to give. I'm so tired." He reached for her hand, calloused and shaking. "You don't have to give anything. Just stay. Just choose to stay." She pulled her hand away, not harsh but firm. "I need time." The next morning she was gone before the sun had burned through the clouds. She left the children with Elijah, said she needed to think, to walk, to clear her head. Elijah didn't follow. He made breakfast, braided the girl's hair, carved a toy for the littlest boy who still cried in his sleep. But when the sky darkened and the snow began to fall again, he stepped outside, heart heavy, and followed the ridge trail. He found her by the river bend, seated on a boulder shoal pulled tight around her shoulders. She didn't turn when she heard him, just spoke quiet and slow. "I walked this far with him once, years ago, when he still made me laugh, when I still believed in things." Elijah didn't speak. "I keep waiting for someone to make the choice for me, but maybe no one can. Maybe that's the whole of it." She looked at him now, her face raw with cold and truth. "I want something steady," she said, "but I also want to be free." "You can have both," he said. "No," she whispered, "but I can have peace. And maybe love." He took a step closer. "And what about him?" "I'll write him," she said. "Tell him the children are safe, that they're warm. But I won't go back. Not now. Maybe not ever." The snow thickened, laying a hush over the land. No wind. No sound but breath. She reached for him this time with certainty, her fingers threading through his. "I choose you," she said. It was not loud, not dramatic, but it was final. And it was enough. The snow didn't stop for 2 days. It piled soft across the roof, pressed against the windows, covered the woodpile in a clean white hush. Inside, the shack was warm, tight-knit. The stove burned through every hour, its orange glow flickering against the walls. Elijah didn't leave her side, not in the way that mattered. They worked in rhythm, him chopping, her baking, him patching boots, her mending sleeves. They didn't talk much about what had passed. There was no need. The choosing had been done. Clara moved differently now. Not lighter exactly, but steadier. When she looked at him, it wasn't with fear or hesitation. It was with trust. It was with a quiet, worn-in kind of hope. The kind that doesn't shine. The kind that stays. The children took to him more each day. Little Thomas, still too small to speak full sentences, had taken to calling him Pa by accident, then froze when he said it. But Elijah just smiled, reached down, and lifted him into his arms without saying a word. Clara had seen it, standing in the doorway, her hand pressed to her chest, her eyes full of something sharp and grateful. Still, the world didn't stop just because they had found a place in it. One morning the rider came. Elijah spotted him from the ridge. A man in a long wool coat, riding a chestnut horse, moving slow like someone with questions. He rode all the way to the yard before he dismounted. Clara came out to meet him, hands on her hips, children peeking from behind her skirts. Elijah approached, boots crunching through the snow. "You Elijah Turner?" the rider asked. "I am. The man nodded toward Clara. "And this is Mrs. Hale." Elijah didn't answer. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the man said. "Name's Jarvis. I work rail security out of Fort Garland. Thomas Hale sent me." Clara stiffened. Elijah stepped between them. "He sent a letter," Elijah said. She replied, "That ought to settle it." Jarvis took off his gloves, stuffed them in his coat pocket. "He's filed for custody. Wants the children brought to him. Claims abandonment on her part." Clara's breath caught. The children heard the word custody and shrank back. Elijah's voice turned low. That man left them to starve. Jarvis sighed. Ain't saying I agree. Just saying what's been filed. There's a hearing in 2 weeks in town. Judge Brannan. Clara's hands trembled. Elijah could see it, even as she tried to stand tall. I'll be there, she said, voice steady. Jarvis nodded. I figured you would. He turned to go, then paused. Bring witnesses if you got any. And records. It won't be easy, but Brannan's fair. He mounted his horse, tipped his hat, and rode off through the snow. That night, Clara barely spoke. She sat by the stove, sewing in her lap, though she wasn't stitching much of anything. Elijah moved around the room, restless. He doesn't deserve them, he said. No, she whispered. We'll fight it. She looked up. Ooh. He met her gaze. I'm not letting him take what he threw away. Clara's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She reached for his hand across the table, gripped it hard. Then we'll fight. In the days that followed, they prepared. Elijah rode to town, spoke to the preacher who'd brought food to the shopkeeper who'd seen the children after they arrived. Clara wrote a statement, long and neat, every word a thread pulled from her memory. She didn't soften anything. She didn't lie. The truth was enough. When the morning of the hearing came, they rode into town on a borrowed wagon bundled in wool and prayer. The courthouse was a low stone building with a single stove in the corner and a judge who wore his coat through the whole proceeding. Thomas Hale sat across from them. He looked older, leaner, but not sorry. He smiled at the children when they came in. The oldest boy looked away. He spoke of redemption, of a job and a room with heat, of blood and name and law. Clara stood when it was her turn, voice calm but fierce. She told them what he'd done, what she'd done to keep them alive. What they had now, not riches but safety. A man who had shown up every day, who hadn't left. When she finished, the room was silent. Judge Brannan looked over his glasses. Then he turned to Thomas Hale. You had your chance, he said. These children will stay with their mother. And with the man who didn't leave, the gavel fell. Outside the wind was sharp, but the sun had broken through the clouds. Elijah helped Clara into the wagon. She looked at him, blinking back tears. You stayed, she said. I told you I would. Her hand found his warm despite the cold, and this time when the littlest girl called him Pa, no one corrected her. Spring crept in slow, like it didn't trust the land to hold it. The snow melted in fits, pooling in the low places, feeding the scrub and coaxing green from branches that had slept too long. The shack was still there, but the barn was now home, solid, warm, and real, in a way Elijah had never known a place to be. Clara planted seeds in a narrow stretch of turned dirt behind the barn. Beans, squash, a row of onions from sprouted bulbs the preacher's wife had sent them with her blessing. The children helped more dirt on their faces than in the ground, and Clara didn't fuss. She just smiled like she was watching something good take root. Elijah built a pen for chickens they didn't yet own, fixed the pump near the creek, patched the wagon wheel that had cracked on the way back from town. His hands never stopped moving, but his eyes lingered more now on the children, on the sky, on Clara's face when she wasn't looking. One night, just before the last frost, Clara brought out an old box wrapped in cloth. She set it on the table and unwrapped it slow, like memory was something fragile. Inside were a few worn books, a scrap of lace, a silver brooch tarnished by years. This was my mother's, she said, holding it out to him. She used to say a woman keeps her stories in the things she carries. Elijah took the brooch, turned it over in his hand. It was shaped like a swallow in flight. What about you? She asked. What do you carry? He was quiet for a long time. Then he pulled from his coat pocket a small leather-bound notebook, edges frayed, corners soft. Belonged to my brother, he said. Wrote in it during the war. Prayers. Names. Things he wanted to build if he made it back. Clara ran her fingers over the worn leather. Did he? No, Elijah said, but I carry it anyway. She closed the box and touched the brooch once more before setting it aside. That's the thing about stories, she whispered. They stay, even when the people don't. Outside frogs had begun to sing in the wet places. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to remind them that the world was turning again. The next day, Elijah drove the wagon into town with the two oldest boys to fetch lumber. When he returned, Clara was waiting at the fence line, hair tied back with a blue ribbon one of the girls had found in a trading sack. "There's a letter," she said, "from the judge." He climbed down, heart-catching. "He's made it final," she said, handing him the folded paper. "Full custody. My name. No contest." Elijah read the line twice before looking at her. "It's done then." She nodded. "It's done." The children cheered when she told them. James, the eldest, ran laps around the barn while the little ones danced in the yard. Elijah stood back watching them with something rising in his chest, something deep and wide and unfamiliar. Clara turned to him, face lit, with a joy so fierce it looked like freedom. "I want to build something here," she said. "Not just a garden. A life. With you." He didn't speak, just stepped forward and took her face in his hands, rough palms against her cheeks. She leaned into him like she'd been waiting her whole life to stop running. Later that night he opened a wooden box beneath the bed. Inside, wrapped in flannel, was a ring. Plain gold. No stone. No inscription. Just a circle worn smooth by time. "My mother gave it to me before I left Missouri," he said. "Said I'd know who to give it to when the time came." Clara didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. She held out her hand. He slid the ring onto her finger. There was no ceremony, no preacher, no crowd. Just the wind outside the low creak of wood, and two people who had lived long enough to understand that love, real love, didn't need to shout. It just needed to stay. By midsummer the garden had taken hold. Beans climbed up twine, Elijah strung between two posts. The squash spread wide and lazy across the soil. Chickens pecked through the yard now, their rust-colored feathers catching sunlight like fire. Clara named them all, and the children gave them stories, some brave, some foolish, all full of life. The barn smelled of hay and saddle oil and flour, and somehow that mix came to mean home. Elijah had carved names into the wall above each child's bed. Not loud declarations, just a soft kind of claiming, like planting a flag in the earth without needing to wave it. He built a cradle, too. No one had asked him to. He just did. Clara watched him plane the edges smooth one warm evening, her belly beginning to show beneath her apron. She stood barefoot in the doorway, the air full of cut wood and creek water. "When I first saw you," she said, "I thought you looked like a man halfway between going and gone." Elijah didn't look up. Wasn't wrong. And now, he set the plane down, brushed shavings from his lap. "Now I know where I am." She crossed the room, slow, careful. Her fingers touched the edge of the cradle, then his hand. "I never believed in second chances," she whispered. He looked at her, then, eyes steady. "This ain't second. This is first. First time I ever chose anything that mattered." The baby was due in the fall. By then they'd cleared a spot near the barn for a larger house. Elijah had drawn the plans himself, simple 2 rooms, a porch to sit on when the work was done. He and James dug the footings in the evenings, the younger ones bringing water and tools, proud to be part of it. There was no talk of leaving anymore. Sometimes Elijah would rise before the others and walk the ridge trail just to look back on what they'd built. Smoke curling from the chimney. A red ribbon tied to the fence post where Clara hung wash. Children's laughter floating across the field. Once he stood there as the sun rose, hands in his coat pockets, the light brushing the land gold. A hawk circled overhead, and for the first time in a long, long while, Elijah Turner let himself feel the full weight of peace. Not the kind that came from escape. the kind that came from staying. Behind him the door creaked open. Clara stepped onto the porch, one hand resting on the small of her back. "You coming in?" she called. He turned toward her face, lined and warm eyes full of something easy and good. "Yeah," he said. "I'm coming." He walked back, slow boots, leaving prints in the morning dew heart, full hands steady toward the home they had made, weathered and real, and theirs. If you've ever stood at the edge of loss, subscribe and see what comes after.